Story 1. COVID-19 sparked something in me, and I've been on fire ever since. I started mowing lawns out of the trunk of my 2003 Accord, then taught myself how to climb and remove trees properly. Now I've got a big truck, a trailer, and a ton of equipment. Before all this, I was an alcoholic server and bartender, super depressed. Now, two of my teenage kids live with me, and I'm in the best shape of my life. Story 2. Girlfriend of a couple of years moved in with me a few months prior to lockdowns. The ensuing months and years of being around her all the time made us realize that we were pretty much made for each other. Now married with twins on the way. The rest of lockdown was bad, though. Story 3. I was a so-called essential worker, meaning I worked at Home Depot, and every wealthy person in 100 miles came in giggling about how they're so excited to be doing home renovations with all the free time they have right now, and, oh, we know we're not supposed to go out, but we're just so bored at home. Meanwhile, my workload increased tenfold overnight. I went home every day sore and exhausted while corporate refused to hire more employees. I didn't recover from the burnout for a few years. It was awful. Story 4. I'll probably say it felt like living in a weird time loop. Every day was the same, but also somehow completely different. It was a mix of baking bread, video calls, and trying to stay sane while the world felt like it was falling apart. Definitely a time nobody will forget. Story 5. It certainly made me well aware of my privilege. Some people were going through absolute hell, but we were relatively unscathed, except for the bizarre chaos unfolding. No planes in the sky, no cars on the road. Some moments were very peaceful. People forgot how to drive. Taking an allowed trip to the shop, I noticed people stopped caring about how well they were driving. 1 hour of outdoor exercise a day. The rule of 6. Continually changing rules. Banging pots and pans. An utterly inept and corrupt government. It's strange to see social distance markers in stores and public spaces now, faded and forgotten. Story 6. I've literally made jokes about this. Grandpa, what did you do in? I still can't believe I survived to tell a tale I don't actually want to tell. Story 7. I worked in retail, the biggest supermarket in the region. First, people were cautious and friendly. 2 weeks in, shelves were empty and people were upset. Every other person started discussing the rules and COVID-19 as a whole. We even had fights happen regularly, mostly because of deniers getting into other people's business. That unpleasant behavior lasted until today. COVID-19 killed a lot of people, but it also killed a lot of decency in people. Story 8. It was strange, so much anxiety, yet oddly peaceful at times. I feel really fortunate that I had a stable work-from-home job and a house with a nice outdoor space. Story 9. I was a registered nurse, and suddenly I was being called a hero by my employer and the rest of the world, and it was nothing but a big fat manipulation tactic. I risked my life and my family's life by being on the front line of COVID-19. I was exhausted and kept going. As COVID-19 became more like the common cold, I was nothing. The management that hid in their homes got big fat bonuses, and I was back to being treated as dispensable. All of a sudden, nursing week did not matter. Our COVID-19 workload became the norm, and expectations were more unrealistic than before COVID-19, and they were unrealistic before already. Health insurance companies became moneymakers that determined what procedures were medically necessary. Medications were being denied, even insulin to diabetics in some cases. Middle class and poor people started dying because they could no longer afford medical care. The United States healthcare system was exposed, and we are lagging behind due to greed. Story 10. A test run of how badly this country would handle a severe crisis. We know that the people will turn on themselves, we know there will be hoarding, and we know that science and reason will be enemies. It could have been a time of unification and strength. Instead, it was the opposite, and frankly, we are lucky it was mostly inconvenient to most Americans. Story 11. During COVID, my life didn't really change at all. I was an essential worker in the southeast of the United States. So, really the only thing that changed was the lack of traffic in my city during my commute time. Story 12. I'm not going through all these comments. As a nurse who worked on a COVID unit from the time it hit the United States, and for 2 years I didn't get the lockdown, I got the post-traumatic stress disorder. Story 13, lonely. I had started a new school the day the lockdown began. I had to leave early that day because I had appendicitis. It was surreal. All the doctors and nurses were wearing trash bags, and the people in the ambulance were wearing actual gas masks. Everyone was freaked out. Story 14, nurse here. I had COVID-19 at the beginning of that March, just before it became a labeled pandemic. My symptoms weren't like what people were told, so I wasn't sure at first. My skin physically hurt to the touch, and I had severe nausea, an achy body, and headaches. With that said, after 2 weeks of recovery, I went back to work at our COVID-19 quarantine unit. At that time, I was the only one to have gotten it. Got paid nicely in the quarantine unit, too. Peaceful as well. We had about 20 beds, our own entrance and exit, and the only admissions I received were confirmed COVID-19 patients. For better or worse, most were pretty chill with it. I sadly saw many die and tried to save many as well. I saw people decline within an hour super fast, their pulse oxygen gradually going down. It was crazy. Quite a few survived, too. Some needed oxygen for months after, some fully recovered. Nice bonuses of hundreds of dollars. No other interruptions from management staff. I was on my own island with my lone certified nursing assistant. We had a little isolated break room as well. I'd pick up shifts, get a bonus for COVID-19, a bonus for picking up, and relieve my buddy for 12 hours. He'd come back and relieve me. Did this for months. I don't think I've ever had such a lucrative time working. So while others had to close things down and quarantine, isolate, and lack in-person interaction, I still went out and worked. My perspective on COVID-19 seems to be much different than most. My wife's a teacher, and our kids were young in elementary and middle school. They have very different perspectives than I do. Story 15, weird and eye-opening. I saw on a large scale just how full of nonsense everyone is, and that's across the board, not supporting any side of any issue. I had some strange realization that the only reason I watched professional sports was because I always watched professional sports. Once COVID-19 happened and the leagues halted, I realized I didn't really need to watch millionaires playing children's games. I got outdoors and came to an understanding that media, for the most part, is just a cycle of outrage and fear to keep people hooked for consumption purposes. Thanks, but I'll be fishing as the world burns, and wondering what common household item in my cabinet might kill me. Story 16. Our government pushed 1 million normals into an active volcano while scrambling to send blank checks to wealthy individuals who already could have retired at any given moment, under the knowingly insincere guise of helping small businesses who got neglected. All pocketed for personal use, all blindly forgiven by both the previous and current administrations. And if or when those wealthy folks got COVID-19, it was code red and we gave them real healthcare, experimental drugs, and so on to keep them alive. Oh, and tons of people pretended and still pretend that we were under China-style lockdowns because Applebee's switched to pickup only for like 2 weeks, one of the most unserious and faith-losing periods that I've experienced living in the United States for over 30 years. Story 17. That's when it was clear that as a nation we were very dysfunctional. I remember going into a grocery store wearing a mask. A man muttered sheep when he saw me. I responded, "Oh, this," as I pointed to my mask. "This isn't for COVID. I have the flu and don't want to give it to anyone." He sincerely thanked me for my consideration. Story 18. I was a physician in an urgent care for a large group practice. All potentially infectious patients came to us. It was a nightmare. We were only allowed 1 mask a week. The patients did not receive masks. We could not test patients for COVID unless they were hospitalized because there were too few test kits available. No outpatient treatments were available. Story 19. It was surreal, and the only conclusion to make was that the government is insane and does not care at all about the American people. The billionaires did fine and still had parties. Surreal. Story 20. I have always worked from home and found it lonely. Sitting in conference calls where someone joined but I could not really interact, office events I was not a part of, that sort of thing. So for me, it got better. My family was home all the time, which was nice. There was no running around bringing kids to activities or picking them up from school, and everyone started to use communication platforms like Microsoft Teams and Slack, and they kept on doing it. I am one of the lucky ones who remembers it as a nice time. I mean, day to day, personally, I was not enjoying the deaths, political chaos, or knowing that a lot of people were, in fact, having a much worse time. Story 21. It was an absolute disaster. It took away those parts of my job as a teacher that are enjoyable, such as face-to-face interaction, and increased all those aspects that are insufferable, like bureaucracy. I couldn't do my number one stress relief, attending metal concerts, and the reduced social contacts led to anxiety. Looking at the larger picture, it just goes downhill. Thousands died, even more suffered. Conspiracies flourished, misinformation became all-pervasive and started to undermine the democratic systems in Western countries. The COVID-19 pandemic and ensuing lockdowns were the worst period of my life. Story 22. Destroyed my life at the start. Got COVID-19 that led to complications. Went from being a black belt who was super fit to having to teach myself to walk again. Cannot teach martial arts anymore, and I cannot fight. On a plus side, I now have a legal prescription for cannabis in the United Kingdom. I've taken up other hobbies to keep myself occupied, and I've cut out all the selfish people in my life. Story 23. People were stressed. There wasn't a lot of traffic on the road for a few weeks, but ultimately, nothing significant changed because no one actually enforced lockdown measures. This led to people acting like it was all a political stunt, getting sick faster than everyone else. It was very disheartening to follow all the rules and then watch some people ignore them, leading to more unnecessary deaths, because the irresponsible leaders they voted for wanted to try weaponizing the virus against those they saw as enemies. Story 24. I couldn't remember half of it. I was working from home for a call center and was an alcoholic and drug addict through it. Something about toilet paper, a virus killing everyone, and world chaos. Happy to report I'm sober now and have moved way up in life. Story 25. A brief period where we took collective action to help one another, especially the most vulnerable, turned to science and medicine, and ensured everyone had the basic income support needed to survive in our country. Too soon the government stopped taking action to care about other people, and most other people took their masks off literally and figuratively, choosing indoor dining over the public good, our health, or the lives of the most vulnerable. But for a brief fleeting moment, hope in the good and betterment of humanity and the world was restored. Story 26. I would talk to him about how difficult it was not being able to say goodbye to loved ones because of that, but also about the importance of personal care and habits which we were not used to in order to avoid contagion. Story 27. It will probably be along the lines of, "Oh, COVID. COVID was great. The bird flu, then the smallpox, that's when things got really dire. Do you think this rat is done or 5 more minutes?" Story 28. It made me realize that as an introvert, I value the few friends I have, and not being able to see them really affected me. Extroverts may be able to get by on pleasantries, but I want to spend the whole day with 1 or 2 people and then not see them for 2 weeks. Story 29. Being in Melbourne, Australia, the most locked-down city in the world, was rough yet beautiful. I couldn't be outside after 8 p.m. or travel within 5 kilometers of my primary residence. I had to have a letter with me when going to work to say I was an essential worker. I didn't see my family for an entire 18 months due to border closures. But I had some of the best times of my life hanging out with my roommate and her sausage dog, having game nights at my partner's house with his family, and riding a bike down one of the busiest streets in Melbourne and being the only person. So mixed. Story 30. I was surrounded by religious cult conspiracy theorists at the time. It was incredibly scary and isolating. Luckily, I was able to get out of that situation. But imagine people screaming simultaneously that COVID-19 is fake. But oh wait, it's actually real and a bioweapon from the Chinese. Also, masks don't work, but let's inject ourselves with ivermectin. Oh, and Bill Gates is trying to microchip us all with the vaccine. I'm sure these idiots got people killed with the way they spread things. An ex-family member lost their father to COVID-19 and would still get up to preach in his church and spread misinformation and bully anyone who asked a question or dared to wear a mask. It was truly insane to go through, and I don't even think people will believe me in 25 years if I shared the extent of witnessing that side of COVID-19. Story 31. I worked in education during the COVID-19 years. One thing I noticed is how much COVID-19 and isolation-centered policies negatively affected our younger generations. Those who transitioned from middle school to high school during the pandemic were wholly unequipped to handle the responsibilities expected of a young adult. Many of these kids were far behind where they should have been academically and were emotionally stunted due to a lack of socialization. It was painful to see and painfully obvious that the transition was hard for these children. I understood the necessity of social distancing while we waited for a vaccine to a degree, but full-time online learning was a mistake. Many of them never recovered mentally or academically and were difficult to manage once we resumed normal in-person education. Story 32. It was terrible for many people. Aside from those who died or whose loved ones died of this disease, many people died because hospitals were virtually closed. Many died because they could not continue cancer treatments, or because they could not continue their medical checkups for different conditions that required close watch, or because they could not be attended by a physician at all when needed. Others lost their livelihoods because they could not open for business and handouts were not enough to keep the lights on. Many even committed suicide because the handouts were not even enough to feed themselves or their families, or were forced to take exploitative essential worker jobs to pay their bills. Children, especially the very young, suffered greatly and in the following years would suffer from serious developmental and educational issues. Overnight, it appeared students lost their ability to behave in class and many lost and never recovered their social skills. But others, especially the upper middle and upper class, enjoyed it greatly. Some did not even have to work, they were paid regardless, while those that did could work from home, get their groceries, food, and entertainment from one of the aforementioned exploited people that would drive or bike to their homes and deliver them in person, while spending the rest of the day enjoying themselves with streaming or making sourdough bread or the latest internet trend. This difference in experiences accelerated the Great Divide in many Western nations among their people. Riots, protests, and subsequent elections proved that polarization, with the management of coronavirus disease-19 lockdowns being a topic of discussion during many countries' election cycles.